Hello and welcome to The Luxury of Choice, a B2B sales skills and business podcast brought to you by the training team of George James Limited. My name is Steve Vaughan and I'm a senior sales trainer for George James, as well as the host and the producer of this podcast. This is another of our mid-month interview shows where I talk to subject matter experts on a topic which we think you, the listener, will find of interest and value. Today, I have 3 HR professionals joining me, and we're going to discuss what they are calling the Culture Challenge. So, in no particular order, I have with me Joe Boyd, Katy Davies, and Becky Crisp. So I think, ladies, we should start by introducing you and explaining who you all are. So, Becky, could I start with you? Could you just perhaps in 30 seconds give you a brief intros to yourself and a bit about your background?
Yes, thanks, Steve. So I'm Becky Crisp. I'm sorry you can't see my face today, but maybe that's a good thing.
That's okay. It's an audio podcast.
Oh, okay. There you go then. So I'm an HR consultant at George James. So I work with small startups, scale-ups, spin-outs within the life sciences sector. So I've been doing that for several months now successfully. Cool. Prior to that, I've had a career in the scientific space. So with Twist Bioscience, Horizon Discovery, and then Johnson Matthey. I'm passionate about people. Obviously, you have to be in HR, I think.
Yes.
Given the challenges that we face and have to deal with. So yes, I'm passionate about this particular topic. So culture is really, really important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Becky. And a bit of overlap for some of the companies I've worked with there as well, and some of the companies I've sold to in my career as well. So Katy, perhaps you could just do the same for us.
So I'm a bit of a spy in a camp because I'm not actually an HR professional. So by background, I'm an accountant, but please don't stop listening. I'm not going to talk about anything financial. But over the course of my career, I've been called not a typical accountant, which is just, I've worn that as a badge of honor, which probably says something about maybe picking a slightly ill-fitting career route for the first part of my journey. But to me, discovering kind of the importance of culture and the empowering factor that can bring to an organisation, or the crippling factor that can bring to an organisation, has been kind of one of the biggest revelations in my career, and kind of ended up leading to me kind of moving out of finance into ops. And then for the last kind of 4 or 5 years, I've been managing director of a manufacturing company based in Suffolk, where it was a full-on turnaround adventure, pretty much rooted in fixing the culture, getting people actually working together, getting people focused on customer service, So culture across the whole organisation, getting them working together. And I am now, as of about 3 weeks ago, managing director of a skills provider. So similar thing, great team, really great bunch of people. Obviously, what we do is about empowering people. So our culture needs to be right to then kind of percolate across to our learners who are trying to kind of improve their lot in life. So yeah, massive believer in the power of culture. And to me, it all boils down to people, whatever industry you're in.
Absolutely.
It involves people. Even if you're not an employer of people, you're impacting people. And
absolutely,
it comes down to culture. So.
Fascinating. So looking forward to exploring a bit more about that in the podcast. Thank you for being here. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So I am a HR professional. I'm not a spy in the camp, and I have been for quite some time. I have spent 20 plus years, won't tell you exactly how many, in HR from the ground up. So I've done the hard yards, and I worked in retail. So I started my career, which is very fast paced, but also very solid in terms of processes. So really good foundation. Latterly in my career, working with engineers. And you talk about culture challenge, some people will say, engineers are a specific type of employee, but that's a challenge I quite readily enjoyed. And so like Becky, in the last 6 months, I've gone on my own. I'm an independent HR consultant, but the culture piece really interests me. And one of the things I found in my sort of earlier career was that people don't do what you expect them to do. And that really puzzled me. You come to work, there's an expectation, and why are you not fulfilling it? So that led to this sort of my side hustle is social psychology. What makes people behave the way they do, and with a particular interest in the workplace. So it's a hobby, but it's an interest that I bring into work, and it's really interesting for the culture piece. And then more recently, like Katy was saying, and we saw huge shifts during COVID, which made it more obvious and more interesting, I guess. But working with organisations and seeing, the impact of when you get it right, or what kind of organisation you pick up when it hasn't been right. So
absolutely.
That's
fascinating. Yeah. So ladies, great to have you all here. And thank you ever so much for agreeing to be on the podcast today. So we've talked about we've used the word culture a few times now, and that word is used in lots of different contexts in lots of different ways. But let's sort of wind it all the way back. We've called the podcast episode the Culture Challenge. So what do we mean by that, Becky? What is a culture challenge, and why does culture matter in the work environment?
The Culture Challenge is about, we've all worked for those companies where they write it on a piece of paper. You've got your values, your mission and your vision. And so therefore we've got a culture, or it's assumed that we have. But actually the challenge is how we behave, how we treat people, how we treat each other, and how we work together. Are we connected as an organisation? Having it on a piece of paper is one thing. That's a marketing blurb. That's a statement to your customers. But actually, if you don't behave in that way, you've got a fundamental problem. And I often think culture is what happens when the bosses and the leaders leave the room. So what happens then? How do people interact? What goes on behind closed doors? So for me, the culture challenge is, as the MD or the CEO of your company, you might think and you might state that your culture is this, but the reality might be something completely different. And that's when you get that toxic environment where you say and do one thing, but actually you're not. Underneath the surface, it's really bad. It's really poor behaviours. People aren't doing what they say on the tin. And that's what culture is about, really. So it's great that a lot of companies will go through this exercise, building what that looks like. But actually, it's the consistency. How do we maintain it? How do we make sure we stay on track? How do we make sure that actually what we say today still works, in terms of behaviour and how people, the way we do things around here? I think, I can't remember who that famous quote came from, but that is essentially it, right? And it is okay if that changes, but it's recognising that as a leader and as businesses.
Not just what we put on our website and in our marketing blurb, but ladies, it's actually what kind of almost like our DNA as an organisation. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah. I worked with a company recently where the leadership team had come up with their culture and their values. And I'm like, hang on a minute. What do the people in your organisation say about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are your thoughts on this, Katy?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think probably the worst example of that I've ever seen was in an organisation I may have worked in previously, where the values ended up being used as sarcastically. So it was if you had one of our treating people well or something, you'd be like, treating people well again, are we? And it's gone when it just becomes a bit of a mockery. But it's the same thing of you put up the posters everywhere, you imbibe everybody when they come in, get baptised in them, but they don't mean anything to anybody, or they're so trite that you might as well have just used ChatGPT to describe, generic organisational values. But I went through a process in a previous company, but we embarked on our kind of articulating our values. It took us a long time to get to the point where I felt like we were ready and we'd set the scene enough to be able to really work on articulating what our values were. And the owners of the group were just shocked that we would ask the people what the values were. I was like, but they belong to everybody. And actually, ultimately, whilst they might behave in a little bit of a weird way and be a bit unpredictable sometimes, we're all human beings. The range of outcomes is going to be relatively narrow because ultimately people want to be respected, they want to be heard, they want to be part of something. Absolutely. They don't just want to be treated like rubbish. But Absolutely. It was just this shock that you would ask the people what they wanted the company to feel like. It was like, well, we all come here every day to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort and energy making it work. I think we all have the right to have a bit of a say in it. And I think, there's nothing worse than stepping into something where it's just been an edict or what's trendy right now. And it just doesn't work. And I think that does more damage than people appreciate.
Fascinating. So what you're saying, this isn't a top-down exercise. This isn't something where we go into a board meeting and say, hey, guys, we've got to do culture. And then we put some values out. This has to come from the bottom up kind of thing.
I think so. And there's nothing to say. So from an operational standpoint, there's nothing to say that you and your leadership team can't have a little bit of a preparatory sesh going through actually what kind of works for you, just so that you're prepared for the conversation and can sort of, make sure that it's kind of guided in a way that still accords with what you will need to achieve and what your strategies are. But again, that range of outcomes is not going to be, it's not going to be too wild. It's coming down to kind of core behavioural kind of human needs, I guess. So,
yeah. And I guess that from your psychology interest, Joe, there's some overlap there as well, possibly in terms of the things we're exploring here. Do you see some synergies there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the things Katy and Becky would have both heard me talk about quite recently is actually what we're talking about here is the language that we use around our values and behaviours. Most organisations will have something about integrity, but actually, is that a nice sounding word, or is that a word that we all connect with? If I'm acting with integrity, do I understand what that means? Do I understand the impact that has on my behaviour? Because actually, everyone wants to be seen that they have integrity, right? So actually, are the words right? And I think that's where we get the top down, bottom up confusion. The board want a specific outcome. Really, collectively is how we're going to get there. And the behaviours aren't that different. It's about respect. It's about telling the truth. It's about being honest about your mistakes. It's about being open to new ways of working. But actually, what are the words that mean something to the people you are asking to do that? So it is a bit of a combination of the two, so that the board might want to know where they're going, but the people need to understand how their behaviours are going to help them get there. When Katy was talking about the workshops, I can remember it was about 9 years ago, where we were working through some values with a group in a department. And because the organisation had dictated the values, so we decided that we'd actually have our own team values, if you like. And I can remember that some of the team members were really keen to have the word passionate in some of the wording about some of their behaviour, because they were so passionate about what they did and what they brought to the organisation. And one team member really batted against it, did not want that in a work environment. And it was a really interesting debate. Ultimately, the group won out. They wanted passionate. And actually the view was, if you're not passionate, maybe you're not right for our team. That was the outcome. That person self-selected. So now if we'd have said we're all going to do a good job, everyone has subscribed to that. But actually, when they were talking about another layer, what this means to us, that this is so important to us, and we're going to put our all into this. This is so important. And so that's what I think we're talking about, really, is the language that goes around that and how that engages with everybody that we're asking to play a part.
Passionate is a word I often see on people's LinkedIn profiles. I'm passionate about customer service, but I think sometimes it's a word that people use almost as a throwaway comment, really. And I'm sure I can think of people in my career I've worked with that were absolutely passionate about what they did. I'm sure the three of you can as well. So what influences culture then? We've all now recognised that, or talked about the fact that every business has a culture, perhaps if they realise it or not really. But what are the main things that influence and drives culture, Becky? What are the big movers and shakers around culture?
Well, firstly, everybody influences the culture. It's who you employ, what job roles they've got, what product or service you're providing, what your strategy is, what your leadership are like. All of those all the environmental factors influence culture, really. Kind of what's normal, what's the day-to-day, that influences your culture. Trying to be something you're not is not going to help with your culture, is it? It's what's natural. What do you want people to do? What do you want them to be? If you're going for high performance, what does that look like as a business? And it's really drilling down into those things. When you're trying to define what your culture is, that's something you would be taking a look at as a team, getting everybody involved. What do they like about working at the organisation? What's good? What's bad? What do we need to improve on? All of those things will influence your culture.
Sure. And I think you also mentioned, I think it was you earlier, Becky, about the importance of the leadership. It's not just putting things on a wall and saying, tick, we've done culture, but actually doing what they say and saying what they do. Yeah. Is that a big part of it as well, ladies? Would we think on that one?
I think the biggest shock to most leadership teams is that culture is something you have to work on. Mm-hmm. It isn't we will tell people how to behave and then they will go and do it. And it'll all be great. It'll be fine. Yeah, we're just going to say, go and do this and they'll do it. Absolutely not. And what influences culture is such a big question, because it is everything, and it's how you define it, and it's how you manage it, and it's how you celebrate it. Mm-hmm. So there are so many things that have an impact. It's that remembering that culture is an outcome of all of that. Right. Culture isn't something you do. It's an outcome of what you do.
It's an effect, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's so often all an amalgamation of all the little things. Sorry to interject, Jo.
No,
but,
go ahead. Yeah.
One of the biggest things that has surprised me over my career is how people just assume that leadership is easy. Like they're in the hierarchy, they've got a title, and that means that they're the leader. Absolutely not. Like every single small gesture or choice of word can influence the behavior of your team. And I know this is like a sales audience, so it's not a surprise to anybody listening, but it's so interesting seeing when somebody doesn't get that and they can be using kind of really poor language, or they can be, that then sets what is acceptable. So it's really fascinating seeing just how those what seems like tiny things. And again, it's not, we talk about authenticity a lot, and Becky was just talking about what comes naturally. Yeah, it is, but also being aware of your professionalism and aware of what that leadership shadow is casting, because you're setting the tone from that. And I think if you can get that right, then the other little bits feed into it, like choices of word, like Jo said, allowing people to be open. You're just starting to nudge all of those little bits that come together to form what is that cohesive culture.
Just touching on that, actually, Jo will probably say the same. The amount of leaders that I've worked with over the years that avoid having a conversation, the amount of times I've had to go in and step in and do. For me, I guess, is an easy thing. It's my job, it's my career to help people have that. But leaders still have a problem with sharing weaknesses or their vulnerabilities or talking about those things. And actually talking about those things just makes them human to the employee population.
Completely.
Because the employee population goes, the CEO made a mistake and they did that. Okay, so maybe, next time I should put my hand up and say, well, actually, I did make that mistake. I remember very early on in my career, I've always had this style where I'm really open and honest, as two of the other ladies on this call. I remember making a big mistake, and I remember going to my manager at the time, and I wasn't in HR then, and saying, I've made this massive mistake. And the manager at the time, he just didn't know how to handle my honesty. He was gobsmacked that I hadn't just pushed it under a carpet and hidden it
or blame someone else.
Yeah, or blame somebody else. Whereas I would always put my hand up, and he was awkward about it. I think we've got to get over that as leaders, as employees, as people, and we've got to go and put our hands up and go, do you know what? I'm not very good at this, but this is your strength and this is how you can help me. And that's how you bring people on the journey, which helps build the culture. The other issue is having those real conversations. So time and time again, I work with leaders who don't want to tell people they're performing poorly.
Yeah.
And they make it into a really big negative conversation. They almost build the anxiety and anticipation before they go into the conversation. So it's already doomed. Well, actually, as an employee, I want to know where I'm falling short, because that's how I'm going to help you be successful as a business.
Right.
And these things are all things that drive your culture, help you perform better, help people feel engaged, help them feel engaged because they are improving what they do and they're feeling valued.
Absolutely.
Through that improvement.
We run sales leadership and sales management training within the training team here at George James, and I think you described really well is the difference between managing and leading. We see lots of managers. We don't see it often many great leaders. I ran a course for some sales managers recently, and I said to them, how often do you have a one-to-one with your team where you basically say, it's your time, you tell me what you want to talk about? And it was like I was speaking Chinese to them, really, because they used to having one-to-ones where they do forecast reviews, pipeline reviews, but none of them do a one-to-one where they say, how are things? What do you want to talk about? Is this the kind of thing we're talking about here, Katy? I see you nodding furiously.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my head's going to fall off in a minute from nodding so much. Yeah, definitely. And I think a bit like Becky, I think I feel like I've just been, too honest in my career, and sometimes disarms people. But just, sitting down with people and just even sharing a problem. Sometimes, other leaders just look at you like you've got a third head. You're like, right, we've got this. We're not very good at it. How are we going to fix it? And people are like, well, you should know because you're the boss. It's like, don't ask me to fix it because I don't do your job. I can fix it, but you hate it, like 100% guaranteed. I think on that kind of difficult conversation point, I like to oversimplify things, and that is a bit of a natural flaw. But 100% of the time, if you set out your stall with employees, with your team, with whoever, So it's really clear what the expectations are. You've given people, you've taken into account how those people work. You've given them the sort of conditions to be able to thrive. When it then doesn't happen, or if they cock something up, or you do have to have a bit of a difficult conversation, it becomes the easiest conversation to have because it's really open. Does that make sense? So it's completely. You've had that kind of those interactions which are based on kind of trust and respect. When it flips the other way, it just becomes really easy. It's not this weird thing because you've just ignored it for so long that to then turn around and say, actually, it's not very good, or we're going to have to let you go, or whatever else it is. It's not a surprise. It's not then calling in Becky or Joe to hold your hand, because it then becomes a really difficult conversation where you're on some pretty thin ice and they're having to work a bit of magic to get you out of it. You're actually just having a progressive conversation.
Absolutely.
And it's really straightforward. There's no trauma to it. So it's really fascinating.
And the consequence of not doing so is when you see these toxic cultures build, because managers will avoid it. Then Joe Blogs over there isn't performing, but nobody's ever mentioned it to him. Whereas I'm working my butt off over here and I'm not getting recognised either, but he's getting away with doing nothing. And I'm working all the hours God sends. And, we're being treated exactly the same. Nobody's managing anybody here. And then that manifests across teams, so, and that's when the toxicity builds, because then people start to get resentful, or we're not behaving in the same way, or we're not doing.
And that toxicity word is something I wanted to explore. So, Joe, what happens when all this stuff goes wrong and the companies don't get this right in terms of, what we've used the phrase now, a toxic environment? I can think of times in my own career where there's been a lot of toxicity around the culture of the organisation. I won't name organisations, obviously, but what manifests itself when we've got that toxic culture? How does that actually come out in terms of the organisation and its behaviour?
So you're going to have some obvious things like people will leave. People will talk about your organisation. Becky talked earlier about culture being what people say when the managers leave, or how they behave when the managers leave. But that also can be externalized. How do people see your organisation? What do your employees go home and say about your organisation? So you can lead to a poor reputation that you struggle to replace people who have left, because people go, I don't want to go and work there. This goes on, that goes on. So you lose people, you struggle to recruit. People start to disengage. It can affect performance. We've all probably worked in organisations where a manager's upset everybody, so they're all around the water cooler moaning about what's going on, not actually doing the work. So it can have all of that. So they're the kind of obvious things, but that has an impact on creativity. People don't feel safe. They won't take a risk. They won't admit to mistakes. Sure. So it starts to affect things at a deeper level. And actually, they can really be quite damaging for an organisation. Then what you can have is, another perhaps obvious thing, but you can have people start to fall out, and then you start to have grievances. So again, that externally, that starts to leak out and affect the reputation of the business. And when you've got salespeople on the line, understanding, they're then trying to work with customers who are either not getting their products because productivity's dropped, the quality's dropped because people aren't caring anymore, the products aren't innovative or creative. And they hear about the toxic culture. So that's a hard sell. So it starts to, just like everything impacts how positive your culture is, a negative culture starts to impact how successful and effective your business is going to be.
Interesting. So let's then turn that around. So I think, Katy, you said you worked in an organisation where you've had a real turnaround in the culture of the organisation with lots of positive benefits to the business. But what is it you did? How did you go on? How did you start that process, and how did it manifest itself?
Took some time and some energy and some effort. I'm a lot grayer. And having, incredible support around you. So, Joe was definitely on that journey with me, and I'm incredibly grateful for that kind of expert support. The biggest start for 10 is kind of recognising the problem. It's like alcoholism, isn't it? Or some sort of addiction, recognising that this is really bad, and actually going to have to make some difficult moves, especially if you're new into an organisation, having to make those moves. My one regret is not making those moves quicker. So actually, who are the people that are really contributing to this toxicity, or just can't see the impact of their poor leadership, or whatever you want to characterise it as, making sure you deal with those, because without having, from a leadership team standpoint, so, from my position as kind of MD, having those people around you to help promote values that you want to drive into the organization and how you want to start shaping it without that support around you, it's very hard work. It's quite lonely and it's really painful and it will be slow. So, having to make some fairly big moves and make it really clear to the leadership team that you inherit or that are around you kind of what those expectations are, not in a hard way, but just through those, like open one-to-ones with people around, like, what frustrates you about the current organization, what could be fixed? You're teasing out of people what they don't quite like in the current culture, what they wish they could have more of. And you start to just show them that is actually possible. That's a perfectly acceptable way for an organization to work. And actually, you're listening to them, which is another part that sort of sets that kind of roller coaster going. Each journey will be slightly different depending on what you've got, there, but definitely getting that team right, getting that sort of structure right in your business to make sure that it facilitates that. Because again, it can be the biggest blocker to actually getting anything kind of achieved. Sure. And then from there, for me, it's just absolutely living and breathing what you want it to be every day. Somebody said to me, I had an old boss, actually, he was brilliant. And he used to say, like, leadership is exhausting. It's like brilliant, it's thrilling and it's great, but it is exhausting because you're constantly on, if you have a bad day, it's fine to have a bad day, but you have to manage that bad day with your people and just kind of front it up and be like, oh, do you know what? I'm not feeling it today. I'm really sorry, gang. Like, but, because humanity is still fine. But you have to own everything you do. Otherwise, it's almost like that, trust is hard for, easily lost. It's the same sort of thing. So it's constantly keeping on top of it and making sure that your leadership team are kind of doing the same thing and are on the same mission. So yeah, every journey will be slightly different, but that's kind of my biggest starter for me. And just being brave enough to actually go, this is not right. This culture that we've got here is not right. It's not doing things for people and we need to do something about it and not just kind of letting go and sinking into it and letting it wash over you.
Fascinating. Yeah. So if I'm listening to this podcast right now and I'm in my car, driving up the M6 somewhere, as our listeners tend to be, seeing customers now, and if this is resonating with me, I'm thinking, this is my organization. Our culture is not right, Becky. So can anybody make the change to the culture? Can it start with the salesperson, the service engineer, the customer service person? Or does it have to come from the top, Becky? What do you think on that?
It does come from the top, but it comes from everybody, right? Because we all have to be engaged in it. It's about that willingness to understand when it needs to change and flex and adapt that I think is important as well. I once worked for a startup company. They were brilliant. The CEO was really, really good. And he had a really great style about him. So he used to say that, if you can do your job in 2 hours, brilliant. Come and do your job, do it in 2 hours, go home. If you do it in 10 hours, that's okay if that's your pace. As long as you're doing your job and you're performing at your best and you're doing what we need to do as a business, that's great. And I really loved that about him. That's okay as long as you manage everything else, right? But what you've got to understand is that may change in the future. When you're a company of 10 employees, that might be okay. It might be easy to manage. When you're a company of 500 employees, it becomes less so.
Of course,
so what are you going to keep? One of the things I loved about JM is they keep the best things of big and small. So they're built on lots of acquisitions. They keep the best bits of their small company culture and they take the best bits of a large company culture and they merge the two. And actually, that is really successful. They've got really great engagement there. And also, the other key thing is about living and breathing your core values as a leader. Because if you start to steer off course, then others will steer off course. You are looking at your role models within the business. And I truly believe that is the leadership role model behaviours.
Absolutely.
Because people will get their cues from them. So if you start to go off track, your culture goes off track. But also making sure that there is respect, trust and fairness for everybody. And providing that safe space for employees to be able to speak up when things aren't quite right. And for leaders or whoever else in the business to take action in a safe way. If somebody is doing something that goes against everything you say and do as a business, then there should be a forum or a safe space for somebody to go, that's not right. Absolutely. And for it to be listened to and acted upon if necessary. And there are lots of businesses that just don't do that. And ultimately, that accountability does come down to leadership. If I feel brave enough as a manufacturing operative to come and speak to you to say something's not right here, then the least you can do is go and have a look at it, check whether it's right, and go back to that individual and say, thanks for flagging. This is how we've handled it. So it's all of that, plus keeping your finger on the pulse. Things change, things evolve, and they have to evolve. So I think that's important too.
Some really key points there, really. And I can think again of examples of my own career where there's been processes in the company to flag when things were not quite right. And again, perhaps they were more tick box exercises than actually proper processes. But ladies, it's been fascinating finding out more about the world of culture in businesses. If I could get one final thought from each of you as to what businesses need to think about moving forward to whatever 2024 brings us, and none of us know right now, but as somebody listening to this wants to do something about the culture, if I could get one thing from each of you as to, what would be a good first step. Let's start with you, Jo. What would you think on that?
I think it's about working with your business to understand what the culture should be. Engage with everybody and get that language right. Once you're all speaking the same language, it makes the rest of it a little bit easier. So that's the cornerstone for me.
Great, love it. And Katy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're listening to it now, just think over the next 5 minutes. Are you living those values? Is everything you do kind of stacking up what that company culture is that you're in? If it doesn't, is it the right culture for you to be in? Because it's hard to fake it.
Yeah, great.
And it will exhaust you. So there is also a brave decision to make on that front too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not telling everybody to change their jobs, by the way. One from you, Becky?
Yeah, mine's to the leaders out there. You've got to accept that company culture is important. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if you haven't got a great culture, you're not going to be attractive. You're not going to succeed in delivering your strategy.
Absolutely.
So I was just going to add to that, Becky. I think there's a saying, isn't there? Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Yep.
Love it. So fascinating getting to know you all and finding out more about what you do and your experiences and your great thoughts on culture. Where's the best place for the listener to find out more about what you do? Is it LinkedIn for all of you?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So
yes, please.
Just very quickly, just state your name so people can find you. We'll put it on the show notes anyway. But so, Jo, how do you spell your name?
It's just Joboyd. It's really simple. 6 letters.
I found you straight away on LinkedIn. So yeah, Katy, Katy's with a Y, yes?
I'm Katy with a Y and Davies with an IE.
Brilliant, thank you. And Becky?
Becky Crisp. So crisp as in what you eat.
Fantastic, ladies. Thanks again for being on the podcast. So if you've enjoyed the podcast, folks, then make sure you subscribe to the show. And if you listen to us on Apple or Spotify, then we'd love a review. It does help us in lots of mysterious ways. So if you could take a minute just to give us a review, that would be wonderful, dear listener. I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with my colleagues Jonathan and Prue looking at another aspect of B2B sales. But in the meantime, have a great time and we'll talk to you soon.